What's up, game dev crew? Welcome to week 5 in the Forge, where we're going to dive into character. First thing we really want to focus on is how different characters are in games than they are in other forms of media. Let's look at books as a first example. For centuries, literature was the way in which people engaged with new characters and stories. For a long time, the most popular subject matters in books were rooted in reality. They tended to have really complex plots involving a lot of different characters. But more to the point too, with the written word, we were often able to peek inside of those characters' minds. We often read what those characters were thinking. Now let's take the early days of video games as our next example. The subject matter for most early video games was fantasy or science fiction, something completely out of the ordinary. Most of the plots were very simple. Pac-Man, 8 dots and he escaped the ghost. Galaga, you defended Earth from an onslaught of aliens. Didn't go much past that. And what's more, whatever characters you played, you really didn't spend much time with their thoughts or feelings, right? You could be a racer in a race car, but all you're doing is racing a race. Or you were Mario, who was climbing ladders to try to save the princess from Donkey Kong. All this to say, not a whole lot of depth. Fast forward to today, where people are really starting to see the amount of depth that can be brought into characters in video games. When you look at titles like Heavy Rain or the Witcher series, even simpler titles like Unraveled, we're starting to see a lot more rich character development in video games. But it's been a really long road, and let's talk about why. The first thing we need to recognize is that separation between the player and the character in the video game. And the key term here is the avatar. When we take on the role of a character in a game, we are still us here in the real world, but we control most, if not all, actions of this character in the virtual world. And there are two primary ways that this can be done, and that's either through the ideal form or the blank slate. The ideal form is a representation of what you, the player, want to be. This approach is what provides that wish fulfillment we were talking about in world building the other day. Now, I'm certainly not a crack shot like John Marston, nor can I do a roundhouse kick like Ryu. But putting the player in the shoes of these really fleshed out and detailed characters fits them into this ideal form. In other words, it gives you the experience of being this other person. Now, this is in contrast to the idea of the blank slate. The blank slate intentionally leaves out a lot of detail about a character so that you, the player, can project a lot of your own personality into it. It's more iconic. In other words, you're playing the game more as yourself than as somebody else. Now, this can be a sliding scale, and you can find gray area in between the two, but those are the two main ways of approaching an avatar in a game. The player is typically not the only character in a game as well. In fact, the best stories include relationships between other characters. So given a big long list of characters in your story, probably the first thing you want to do is separate the character from the functions or roles that they provide. Now, Link is a character. His function is that he is the hero. Ganondorf is also a character, but his function is that of the villain. If your story requires a hero, a villain, a damsel in distress, a mentor, it's best to really identify those functions before you really obsess over details about character. When you're ready to start diving into the details of characters, it's best to come up with a list of traits that are true about this character and will remain true no matter what situations that character faces. Now, this just really helps round out the character, much in the way those questions about world building help round out this world. It's not necessarily that you're going to use all the content, but it does help bring focus and a sense of realism to this character that you're developing. You want to know what a character likes, what they dislike, any important elements in their past, if they were orphaned or grew up rich and wealthy, how they dress, what some of their skills are, what sort of training they've had. Coming up with a list of traits for a character is really going to help you and others envision that character and make it a lot more fun to interact with them. Next thing, you want to make sure that all the characters in your story or in your game are all different enough from each other to be interesting. If you had 10 characters that all had similar traits and similar views on things, then you don't have a lot of material to work with in terms of interpersonal relationship. For that, you can use what's called the interpersonal circumplex. On this chart are listed a bunch of different behaviors and attitudes that your character could possibly have. If you notice that all your characters are grouped close together on this chart, then you really need to develop some more varied characters to make a story really interesting. For example, take a look at where certain characters from the Star Wars franchise fall on this chart. A good spread like this means that the relationship between any of these characters really has some significance to it, which makes it more interesting. And in that same vein, the next thing you should do is make a character web. Write down each of your main characters, and then in a space below each of them, write what he or she or it thinks of each of the other characters. What are their attitudes towards the other characters in your story? Even if they don't end up knowing each other at all or ever meeting each other in your story or in your game, still from the perspective of that character, what would he or she think of another character in the story? Again, this will help you create more interesting relationships, which in turn creates more interesting dialogue, more interesting situations. It does nothing but good. Now, something to be very aware of when constructing these relationships between characters is the idea of status. Now, it's a very subconscious thing, but whenever you have an interaction with somebody, somewhere in the back of our minds, we're always evaluating where we stand in relation to people around us. Are we on the same level? Are we coming from a place of dominance? Do we feel inferior to the person we're talking to? This dynamic also has to exist with all your characters. If you can imagine a conversation between any two characters and see where the status is between them, then the character is going to seem a lot more aware of each other, which is something you really want. Now, in regards to everything we just mentioned, it's really important to know that really good stories, really powerful stories, have characters that transform over the length of those stories. So that interpersonal circumflex we talked about earlier, you don't necessarily want to see a character remain in the same fixed place throughout the entirety of a story. Through action and situations and conversations, you really want to see characters move to different areas in that circumflex. Keeping their distance from others, mind you. You don't want them all gathering to the same place again. But this movement is really what character development is. If you're a Marvel fan, think about the character arc of Iron Man over the entire series. In the very first film, he was very arrogant, very self-centered, wasn't about to give the time of day to anyone else. And if you watch every Marvel movie from that first Iron Man movie all the way to Endgame, then you can see how Tony Stark's dot moved around on that interpersonal circumflex to a character who is very caring, altruistic, and ultimately willing to sacrifice for others. And it's also really important that along that path, a character surprises us. Right? That's something that taps into the humanity and the relatability of characters. Yes, we as humans have really predictable behaviors, right? We have our habits and we have our routines that we like to fall into because it's comfortable. But every once in a while, we get a wild hair and do something crazy. And your characters need to be able to do that too. That's going to make the player and the audience of these characters see them as a lot more relatable and real. If you know exactly what to expect from any given character at any time, then they can get kind of stale and not interesting. Now, specifically when making video games, there's a lot that's communicated from a character by their voice and facial expressions. Again, this is the human element of being able to connect with a character. The physicality of body language and looking surprised or looking angry. These do a lot to communicate the thoughts, feelings, and attitudes of a character to the player. At any rate, really diving into characters and coming up with characters and their traits and how they relate to others, it's just as fun and exciting as world building. So I hope you have a lot of fun with it. Can't wait to see what you come up with. And we'll see you next week in the Forge.